Ladies and gentlemen, friends, and seekers of truth, let me begin tonight with a simple question. What does it take for a single human being, born in a small town nearly 1,000 years ago, to still be spoken of today, in mosques and homes, in villages and cities, across continents he never even knew existed? What does it take for a man who owned almost nothing, who wore patched clothes, who slept on the bare earth for years, to become one of the most beloved spiritual figures in the history of the Muslim world? Tonight, I want to take you on a journey into the life of that man. A man whose name is whispered with love from Baghdad to Lahore, from Cairo to Jakarta, from Dhaka to Dakar. A man known to millions simply as Ghawth-e-Azam, the greatest helper, and to the world by his full name, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. His story does not begin with power. It does not begin with wealth or armies or thrones. It begins in a quiet corner of a Persian province, in a small town believed to be Naif, near the region of Gilan, south of the Caspian Sea, sometime in the year 1077 of the Christian calendar, which corresponds to 470 in the Islamic calendar. Some historians place his birth a year later, in 1078. Either way, the world into which he was born was a world in transition. The great Abbasid Caliphate, once the shining center of Islamic civilization, was beginning to lose its political grip, even as its cities remained centers of extraordinary learning. It was an age of scholars and scribes, of libraries and observatories, but also an age of uncertainty, where power was slipping from the caliphs into the hands of regional sultans and generals. Into this shifting world, a child was born who would grow up to shape hearts far more powerfully than any army ever could. His family, by most accounts, held a respected lineage. His father, Abu Salih, is remembered as a pious and humble man, and tradition holds that the family's ancestry connected back, through a chain of descent, to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, through both his paternal and maternal lines, linking him to the family of Hassan and Hussein, the grandsons of the Prophet. Whether one accepts every detail of these genealogies as historically airtight, or views them with the caution any careful student of history must apply to centuries-old lineage claims, what is beyond dispute is this: young Abdul Qadir grew up in an environment steeped in religious devotion, in a household where prayer was not a formality but a way of life. From a very young age, something set this boy apart. Stories passed down through generations describe a child who, even in his earliest years, showed an unusual seriousness about matters of faith. One story, often repeated by those who have studied his life, tells of how, during the fasting month of Ramadan, he refused to nurse from his mother until after sunset, even as an infant, as though his very body understood the discipline his soul would one day teach to millions. Now, my friends, whether every detail of such stories can be verified by the strict standards of modern historical method is a fair question, and honest scholarship always leaves room for that kind of humility. But what these stories tell us, beyond their literal details, is how deeply the people who came after him wanted to capture the sense that greatness was present in him from the very beginning. Legends grow around figures precisely because something real and remarkable was there to begin with. At the age of 18, young Abdul Qadir made a decision that would change the course of his life. He decided to leave his home, his mother, and his familiar surroundings, and travel to Baghdad. Now you must understand what Baghdad meant in that era. Baghdad was not simply a city. Baghdad was the beating heart of the Islamic intellectual world. It was a city of towering libraries, of the great house of wisdom tradition, of scholars who had spent lifetimes studying law, theology, grammar, medicine, and philosophy. To travel to Baghdad as a young student was something like a young scholar today, dreaming of studying at one of the world's great universities, except multiply that ambition many times over. Because Baghdad in that century was, in many ways, the intellectual capital of the entire known world, let us understand a little more about the Baghdad he was walking toward, because context matters enormously here. By the late 11th century, Baghdad had already stood for over 300 years as the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, founded by Caliph al-Mansur in the year 762. At its height, this city had been the largest and most sophisticated urban center on earth, home to institutions of learning that drew scholars from Spain to Central Asia. Even as the political authority of the caliphs had weakened by Abdul Qadir's time, with real power increasingly held by Seljuk sultans who ruled in the caliph's name, Baghdad's reputation as a city of scholarship had not dimmed. Its markets were filled with paper makers and booksellers. Its mosques doubled as centers of legal and theological instruction. Its scholars debated fine points of grammar, jurisprudence, and philosophy in gatherings that could stretch late into the night. For a young man with a hunger for knowledge, there was, quite simply, no better place on the face of the earth to be. The journey itself was no small matter. In an age without trains, without cars, without any of the comforts we take for granted. Traveling from the region of Gilan to Baghdad meant crossing mountains, plains, and unpredictable terrain, often in the company of merchant caravans, exposed to the dangers of bandits, harsh weather, and disease. One story tells us that as young Abdul Qadir set out, his mother sewed 40 gold coins into the lining of his coat and made him promise never to lie, no matter what happened. Along the journey, the caravan was attacked by robbers. When one of the bandits asked the young boy if he had anything valuable, he simply told the truth and pointed to the coins hidden in his coat. The bandit, astonished that anyone would admit to hiding gold rather than lie to protect it, asked him why he had told the truth. The boy answered that he had promised his mother he would never lie, regardless of the consequences. It is said that this honesty so moved the leader of the bandits that he abandoned his life of robbery altogether, and the entire group repented on the spot. Whether we take this story as a precise historical record or as a parable meant to teach a lesson about the power of unwavering honesty, the message at its heart has echoed through centuries. That truthfulness, sincerity, and integrity carry a force capable of transforming even the most hardened hearts. This would become, in many ways, a preview of the life he would go on to live. When Abdul Qadir finally arrived in Baghdad, he entered a city bursting with scholarly energy. He began studying under some of the most respected teachers of his time. He studied Islamic jurisprudence according to the Hanbali school of thought, one of the four major schools of Sunni legal tradition, under scholars such as Abu Sa'id al-Mukarrimi, and he also studied under towering figures like Ibn Aqil and Abu al-Khattab al-Kalwadani, two of the most prominent Hanbali jurists of the age. He immersed himself in the study of hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Learning from scholars such as Abu Ghalib al-Bakilani and Abu al-Qasim ibn Bayan, he studied Arabic grammar and literature as well, understanding that mastery of language was essential to properly understanding scripture and law. He is also recorded as having studied under Abu al-Wafa Ali ibn Aqil, one of the most formidable Hanbali theologians of the age, a man whose own life had been marked by controversy and intellectual courage, and whose rigorous method of reasoning left a visible imprint on how the young Abdul Qadir approached questions of law and belief. He studied literature and philology under respected grammarians of Baghdad, sharpening the precision of language that would later make his sermons so memorable. This was not casual or superficial study. The traditional curriculum of a serious student in that era required years of memorization, of attending repeated sessions with a single teacher until that teacher formally certified the student's mastery of a text, a method of education built on direct personal transmission from teacher to student, rather than anything resembling a modern classroom. By the time Abdul Qadir completed this course of study, he had accumulated what biographers describe as a formidable command of Hanbali law, hadith transmission, Quranic exegesis, and the Arabic language itself, a foundation that would support everything he built in the decades that followed. But my friends, these were not easy years for the young student. Baghdad may have been a city of wealth and knowledge, but that wealth did not flow automatically into the hands of a poor young man from a distant province. Accounts of his student years describe genuine hardship. There were times, it is said, when he had so little food that he survived on scraps, on herbs found growing by the roadside, on whatever charity or small earnings he could gather. There is a well-known account describing how, during a period of extreme hunger, he found a piece of straw or a scrap of vegetable matter, and, out of desperation, considered eating it, only to see another poor man in even greater distress reach for the same scrap first, and in a moment of restraint and compassion, allowed the other man to have it, trusting that God would provide for him in some other way. These stories of hunger and self-restraint are not simply anecdotes of poverty. They tell us something profound about the character being formed during these years, a character built not around comfort but around discipline, patience, and trust. It was during this period that Abdul Qadir also came under the guidance of spiritual teachers, not only scholars of law and hadith but masters of the inward dimension of Islam, the tradition often referred to as Sufism or Tasawwuf. This inward dimension focuses not merely on outward compliance with religious law, but on the purification of the heart, the disciplining of the ego, and the cultivation of a direct, living connection with the divine. Among those who guided him in this inward path was Sheikh Hamad ibn Muslim al-Dabas, a teacher known for his asceticism and his rigorous spiritual discipline. Under such guidance, the young man who had already mastered the outward sciences of law and hadith began the much harder task of mastering himself. And this leads us to one of the most remarkable and often discussed chapters of his life, the years he spent in seclusion. After completing his formal studies, rather than immediately stepping into public life as a teacher or preacher, Abdul Qadir Jilani withdrew from society. For a period that many traditional biographers describe as spanning around 25 years, he lived largely in isolation, wandering through the deserts, ruins, and wilderness areas surrounding Iraq. He lived among the remnants of old buildings, in caves, in open desert spaces, cutting himself off from the comforts and distractions of city life. Now, think about what this means, my friends. 25 years. Think of everything that can happen in 25 years of a human life. Careers are built and lost in that time. Children are born and grow into adulthood. Empires rise and fall in shorter spans than that. And here was a man who spent that entire stretch of his life stripped of worldly ambition, stripped of comfort, stripped of recognition, engaged in nothing but the deep, silent, often brutal work of purifying his own soul. This was not a retreat of comfort or leisure. Traditional accounts describe extreme physical hardship during this period. Harsh weather endured without shelter, long periods of fasting, intense spiritual struggle, and what many Sufi traditions describe as direct confrontations with temptation and inner darkness. Some stories describe visions and trials in which he was tested by voices or apparitions offering him worldly power, wealth, or ease, promising him status if he would simply abandon his spiritual path, and describe how, each time, he recognized these temptations for what they were and refused them, holding fast to his devotion to God alone. There is another dimension to this period worth dwelling on. Traditional accounts describe him deliberately choosing the most desolate and inhospitable places to inhabit during these years: ruins along the outskirts of Iraq, open wilderness exposed to scorching heat in summer and bitter cold in winter, places where he would have had no protection, no regular source of food, and no human companionship for long stretches at a time. Some accounts describe him going for days without eating anything at all, sustaining himself on nothing but what little water and wild vegetation he could find. Other accounts describe him spending entire nights standing in prayer, only allowing himself the briefest periods of rest before rising again to continue his devotions. This was, by any measure, an extraordinarily severe form of spiritual discipline, one that few human beings in any era would willingly choose to undergo. And yet, according to the traditional narrative of his life, it was precisely this severity, this willingness to strip away every comfort and every distraction, that allowed him to confront and ultimately master the deepest layers of his own ego and desire, the very forces that his later teaching would identify as the greatest obstacles standing between ordinary people and genuine closeness to God. I share these stories with an important caution, one that any honest speaker must offer. Some of the specific narrative details that have come down to us through the centuries carry the marks of oral tradition, elaborated and embellished by devoted followers over generations, as often happens with beloved spiritual figures across every religious tradition in human history. A careful historian will tell you that separating the precise historical facts from the layers of legend that accumulated around Abdul Qadir Jilani is genuinely difficult, because so much of what we know comes from biographical works written by his devoted students and later admirers, who wrote not as neutral historians but as people conveying reverence and spiritual meaning. But even with that caution in mind, the core, well-attested reality remains solid. This was a man who deliberately withdrew from the world for an extraordinarily long period of disciplined spiritual struggle, and who emerged from that struggle utterly transformed. Around the year 1127, when he was approximately 50 years old, Abdul Qadir Jilani returned to public life in Baghdad. And here begins the chapter of his life for which he is perhaps most famous of all: his career as a preacher and teacher whose words moved entire crowds to tears. He was invited to teach at a small school, a madrasa, that had been established by his own former teacher, Sheikh Abu Said al-Mukharimi. This modest institution, over the course of Abdul Qadir's leadership, grew dramatically in size and reputation, eventually becoming known as one of the most important centers of learning in Baghdad, requiring significant expansion to accommodate the crowds who came to study and to listen. Historical accounts describe how his teaching sessions and public sermons drew audiences that, by some estimates, numbered in the thousands, filling not just the halls of the school, but spilling out into open courtyards and surrounding areas. People came not only from within Baghdad, but traveled from distant towns and provinces specifically to hear him speak. The original school he inherited from his teacher was a modest building, sufficient for a small circle of local students. But as word of his teaching spread, the physical space itself became a constant challenge. Historical sources describe repeated expansions of the building over the years, walls pushed outward, new halls added, And still the crowds grew faster than the structure could accommodate them. On the days he delivered his major public sermons, often on Fridays after the congregational prayer, or on specific mornings set aside for teaching, the surrounding streets are described as filling with people who could not find space inside, standing for hours simply to catch fragments of his voice carried on the wind. Scribes were regularly present at these gatherings, recording his words as he spoke, which is precisely how so much of his sermon material survived to be compiled into written collections after his death. This detail matters, because it tells us that his contemporaries themselves recognized, in real time, that they were listening to something worth preserving for those who would come after them. What was it about this man's speech that could move such enormous crowds? Those who study his surviving sermons, many of which were later compiled by his students and by his own son, into collections such as Al-Fath al-Rabbani, meaning the sublime revelation, and Futuh al-Ghaib, meaning revelations of the unseen, describe a style of preaching that combined deep scholarly precision with raw emotional and spiritual power. He did not simply recite dry legal rulings. He spoke directly to the heart. He spoke about sincerity in worship, about the emptiness of chasing worldly status, about the transformative power of turning back to God in genuine repentance, about the reality that every human being, no matter how far they have strayed, carries within them the capacity to return, to be forgiven, to be renewed. Accounts from that era describe scenes of extraordinary emotional intensity during his sermons. Grown men, hardened by worldly life, are said to have wept openly. Some accounts describe individuals who had lived lives of wrongdoing. Even individuals described as thieves or people involved in serious sin, standing up in the middle of his gatherings, overcome and publicly renouncing their past ways on the spot, choosing then and there to change the direction of their lives. Whether every single such story is preserved with perfect historical accuracy, the broader and well-documented reality is unmistakable. Abdul Qadir Jilani possessed a rare and powerful gift for reaching people at the deepest level of their conscience, cutting through layers of ego and distraction to speak directly to that quiet, often buried part of the human heart that longs for meaning, for forgiveness, and for connection with something greater than itself. What made his message so enduring was that he refused to separate the outward law of Islam from its inward spiritual heart. In his era, there was sometimes tension between scholars who focused primarily on the technical study of law, and mystics who focused on inward spiritual experience, with each side occasionally viewing the other with suspicion. Abdul Qadir Jilani stood firmly as a bridge between these two worlds. He was first and foremost a trained and respected jurist of the Hanbali school, deeply grounded in the study of Islamic law. And yet he was equally a master of the inward path, insisting that true spirituality could never be an excuse to abandon the discipline and structure of religious law, and that true religious law, without a purified heart behind it, remained hollow and lifeless. He often warned against those who claimed spiritual heights while neglecting basic religious obligations. And he equally warned against those who treated religion as mere outward ritual without any inward transformation. For him, the two were inseparable, like the body and the soul of a single living faith. It is worth spending a moment on his written legacy, because these are not vague, second-hand attributions but substantial works that survive and continue to be read today. Al-Gunya li Talibi Tariq al-Haq, his most comprehensive written work, functions almost like a complete manual for religious life, covering matters of ritual purification, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, ethical conduct, and correct belief, all woven together with spiritual guidance on cultivating sincerity and nearness to God. Futuh al-Ghaib, compiled from a series of his teaching discourses, consists of shorter, more intimate reflections on themes such as trust in God, patience during hardship, the dangers of showing off one's piety, and the inward states a sincere believer passes through on the path towards spiritual maturity. Al-Fath al-Rabbani, compiled from sermons he delivered over a period of roughly a year and a half toward the end of his life, offers perhaps the most vivid picture we have of him as a living, breathing teacher, addressing the specific struggles, questions, and weaknesses of the people sitting in front of him, often with remarkable directness and even occasional sharpness when addressing hypocrisy or spiritual laziness among his listeners. Reading these works today, one is struck by how conversational and immediate they feel, not distant theological treatises, but the recorded voice of a man speaking urgently to people he clearly cared about. This balanced vision became the foundation of what would eventually be known as the Qadiriyya order, one of the oldest and most widespread Sufi orders in the history of Islam. Now, my friends, I want to pause here and clarify something important, because this word order can sometimes be misunderstood, This was not a political organization, not a hierarchy built for worldly power. It was and remains a spiritual lineage, a chain of teaching and mentorship in which students learned not just intellectual content but a way of life, a method of disciplining the self, cultivating sincerity, and drawing closer to God, all passed down from teacher to student across generations. Abdul Qadir Jilani did not necessarily set out with the deliberate goal of founding an organized movement in the way we might think of institutions today. Rather, his students, and later his own sons, several of whom became respected scholars in their own right, carried his teachings forward, formalizing and structuring what had begun as his personal method of spiritual guidance. Over the centuries that followed, the Qadiriyya order spread with extraordinary reach, carried by traveling scholars, traders, and missionaries into regions as far apart as North Africa, West Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, the Balkans, and Southeast Asia. Today, communities that trace their spiritual lineage back to Abdul Qadir Jilani can be found on nearly every continent. A remarkable testament to how far the influence of one man's inward transformation, undertaken in the deserts outside Baghdad, could eventually travel. Let us talk for a moment about what he actually taught, because it is easy to speak in vague terms about spiritual greatness without grounding it in the substance of the message itself. At the very core of Abdul Qadir Jilani's teaching was the concept of sincerity, what is called in Arabic ikhlas. He taught that actions performed for the sake of appearing pious in front of others, actions done to gain status or reputation, however outwardly correct they might look, were spiritually hollow. True worship, true righteousness, had to be rooted in a sincere intention directed toward God alone, free from the desire for human praise. He often spoke about the danger of what he called hidden idolatry, the subtle ways in which pride, the desire for recognition, and attachment to one's own image can quietly corrupt even seemingly religious actions. He also placed enormous emphasis on the concept of repentance, tawbah, teaching that no matter how far a person had strayed, no matter how deep their sin, the door of return to God remained open, provided the return was genuine and accompanied by real change in behavior. This message, of course, is one of the reasons his sermons had such powerful effect on people who had lived difficult or morally troubled lives. He offered not condemnation but a path forward, grounded in hope rather than despair. He taught extensively about the concept of tawakkul, trust in God, teaching that anxiety over worldly provision, over wealth, over status, stemmed from a lack of trust that God would provide for those who sincerely sought Him and did their rightful effort in the world. This did not mean, in his teaching, that people should abandon effort or responsibility. Rather, it meant balancing sincere effort with an inward peace, a release of the anxious grasping that so often defines human relationships with money, status, and security. He described the spiritual journey of the human soul as passing through distinct stages, drawing on Quranic concepts of the self. He spoke of the nafs al-amara, the soul that commands toward evil, the lower self driven by base desires, ego, and impulsive appetite. He spoke of the struggle to move beyond this stage toward the nafs al-lawama, the self-reproaching soul, the stage at which a person begins to recognize their own faults and feel genuine remorse for wrongdoing. And he described the ultimate goal as reaching the nafs al-mutmaina, the soul at peace, the stage at which a person's heart, through sustained discipline, sincerity, and closeness to God, finds a deep and stable inward tranquility, no longer tossed about by every desire or fear. Importantly, Abdul Qadir Jilani was also known as a fierce defender of orthodox Islamic belief, and he actively wrote and spoke against what he considered deviations from sound theology and practice. In his major written work, Al-Gunya li Talibi Tariq al-Haq, often translated as Sufficient Provision for Seekers of the Path of Truth, he laid out detailed guidance on Islamic law, correct belief, and spiritual conduct, explicitly warning against innovations he believed strayed from the core teachings of the Quran and the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. This is an important point, because it shows us that his spiritual authority was never separate from rigorous scholarly grounding. He was not a figure who abandoned structured religious knowledge in favor of vague mysticism. He was, simultaneously, one of the most respected jurists of his school and one of the most influential spiritual guides of his era, refusing to let either dimension of his religious life eclipse the other. Beyond his teaching and preaching, Abdul Qadir Jilani was renowned for his generosity and his direct engagement with the practical needs of the poor and vulnerable around him. Historical accounts consistently describe him as someone deeply committed to charity, someone who used whatever resources came to him, whether through gifts from students or through the revenues of the school he led, to feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and care for orphans and travelers. Stories describe him personally attending to the needs of strangers who arrived at his school seeking shelter or food, treating even the most humble visitor with dignity and warmth. His household is described as a place of remarkable hospitality, where guests, no matter their status, were welcomed and cared for. We should also remember that Abdul Qadir Jilani was, alongside everything else, a husband and a father, living an ordinary domestic life even as his public reputation grew to extraordinary proportions. He is recorded as having married and raised a large family, with sources describing as many as 49 children over the course of his life, though the number recorded in different biographical sources varies. Several of his sons grew into respected scholars in their own right, continuing his teaching after his death and helping to formalize the transmission of his legacy through the generations that followed. This detail matters because it reminds us that his greatness was not built on withdrawal from ordinary human responsibility. He did not abandon family life in pursuit of spiritual achievement. He carried the discipline, sincerity, and generosity that defined his public teaching directly into the private responsibilities of raising a family, providing for a household, and maintaining the ordinary daily obligations that every person, regardless of spiritual stature, must contend with. In this sense, his life offers a model that feels genuinely attainable rather than distant, a reminder that spiritual depth need not require the abandonment of ordinary human commitments, but can instead be woven directly into the fabric of everyday responsibility. It is worth pausing on this point, because it tells us something important about the nature of his greatness. He was not a distant, untouchable holy man, surrounded by ceremony and isolated from ordinary people. Quite the opposite. His impact on the people of his time came precisely because he remained accessible, because he engaged directly with the struggles of everyday life, the hunger, the poverty, the moral confusion of people navigating a difficult world. His spirituality was not an escape from the practical realities of human suffering. It was expressed through direct, hands-on engagement with that suffering, one of the most striking aspects of his character, repeatedly emphasized across historical accounts, was his consistent refusal of worldly power and position. In an era when religious scholars were sometimes drawn into the orbit of political rulers, offered positions, wealth, and influence in exchange for lending religious legitimacy to those in power, Abdul Qadir Jilani is remembered for steadfastly avoiding such entanglements. He is said to have turned down offers of prestigious positions and material rewards, choosing instead to remain focused on his teaching, his charitable work, and his spiritual guidance of ordinary people. This refusal was not born of arrogance or disdain for those in power. Rather, it reflected his consistent teaching that closeness to worldly status and wealth carried real spiritual danger, and that a teacher who allowed himself to become entangled in the pursuit of position could no longer speak with a pure and unclouded voice to the people who depended on his guidance. As his reputation grew, so did the body of stories describing what are called karamat, miraculous or extraordinary occurrences attributed to saints and spiritually elevated figures within the Islamic tradition. These stories describe instances of him seeming to know hidden information about people who came to see him, instances of apparent physical healing attributed to his prayers, and various other accounts of unusual events surrounding his life and teaching. Now, my friends, as I mentioned earlier regarding the stories of his youth, a careful and honest approach to history requires us to hold these accounts with appropriate humility. Many of them were recorded generations after his death, compiled by devoted followers whose purpose was less about strict historical documentation and more about conveying reverence, inspiration, and the felt sense of his spiritual greatness. This is a pattern we see across many religious traditions, where the towering impact of a beloved figure naturally generates layers of storytelling over time. What we can say with confidence, resting on firmer historical ground, is that his contemporaries and near-contemporaries regarded him as an extraordinarily influential spiritual authority, someone whose reputation for sanctity and wisdom was already substantial during his own lifetime. Quite apart from whichever specific miracle stories may have been added or elaborated in the generations that followed, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani continued teaching, preaching, and guiding students in Baghdad for decades, living to what was, for that era, a remarkably long life. He passed away in the year 1166 of the Christian calendar, corresponding to 561 in the Islamic calendar, at an age of roughly 89 or 90 years. His death in Baghdad was met with profound grief among his students and the wider community who had come to see him as a central spiritual guide of their generation. He was buried in Baghdad, and his tomb, located in the area known as Bab al-Sheikh, became and remains to this day a significant site of visitation and reverence, drawing pilgrims and visitors from across the Muslim world who come to pay respects at the resting place of a man whose influence stretched so far beyond his own lifetime. His legacy did not end with his death. In many ways, it only began to expand. His sons, several of whom had studied directly under him and had absorbed both his scholarly and spiritual training, took up the responsibility of carrying his teachings forward. His son Abdul Razak is credited with compiling and preserving several of his father's written works and recorded sermons, ensuring that the substance of his teaching would not be lost, but would be available to future generations of students. Over the following centuries, the Qadiriyya order that grew from his teaching spread outward from Baghdad in every direction, carried by traveling scholars and spiritual teachers who established branches of the order across an enormous geographic range. In the Indian subcontinent, the influence of Abdul Qadir Jilani became especially profound and enduring. Across Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, he is affectionately and reverently known by titles such as Ghaus-Pak, meaning the pure helper, and Piriyan-e-Pir, meaning the guide of guides, or the master of spiritual masters. Countless mosques, religious schools, and charitable institutions across South Asia bear his name or are dedicated to preserving and teaching his spiritual method. Annual commemorations of his death anniversary, known as his Urs, draw enormous gatherings of devoted followers who come together to recite his teachings, engage in remembrance of God, and reflect on the example of his life. In North Africa and West Africa as well, branches of the Qadiriyya order became deeply woven into the social and religious fabric of local communities, influencing patterns of Islamic scholarship, social organization, and spiritual practice that persist to this day. In places like Mauritania, Senegal, Nigeria, and Sudan, Qadiriyya teachers established centers of learning that combined religious instruction with agricultural and community organization, shaping entire regional patterns of Islamic practice that scholars of African religious history continue to study closely. In the Ottoman lands, from Anatolia to the Balkans, Qadiriyya lodges, known as tekkes or zaviyas depending on the region, became centers of both spiritual training and social welfare, offering shelter to travelers, food to the poor, and a structured environment for the transmission of his teachings across generations of students who had never set foot in Baghdad, but who considered themselves spiritually connected to him through an unbroken chain of teachers reaching back to his own lifetime. This chain of transmission, referred to in the Sufi tradition as a silsila, is itself worth understanding, because it explains something important about how his influence managed to travel so far without the aid of modern communication or organized institutions in the way we understand them today. Each teacher in the chain would formally authorize a small number of trusted students to carry the teaching forward, a process that demanded years of close personal mentorship before such authorization was granted. This meant that the spread of his teaching, however wide it eventually became, was never a matter of mass superficial transmission. It moved outward slowly, deliberately, teacher to student, generation after generation, each link in the chain responsible for preserving both the substance and the spirit of what had been passed down. That such a chain could stretch, largely intact, across nearly 1,000 years, and across so many distinct cultures and languages, from Arabic-speaking Baghdad to Urdu-speaking Lahore to Hausa-speaking West Africa, stands as remarkable testimony to the depth and adaptability of what he originally taught. Now, my friends, having walked through this history together, I want to step back for a moment and ask a broader question. Why does any of this matter to us today, in a world so radically different from 11th and 12th century Baghdad? Why should the story of a man who lived nearly 1,000 years ago hold any meaning for us now, in an age of smartphones, of instant communication, of a world utterly transformed by technology and social change that he could never have imagined? I would suggest to you that the answer lies precisely in the timelessness of what he taught, because the struggles of the human heart have not changed nearly as much as our external circumstances have. Consider his emphasis on sincerity, on doing good not for the sake of appearing good in front of others, but for the sake of genuine inward integrity. Is that lesson not more relevant than ever in an age when so much of our lives are performed for an audience? When social validation has become such a powerful and at times corrosive force in how people make decisions about their own lives? Consider his teaching on repentance, on the possibility of return and renewal, no matter how far one has strayed. In a world that often seems to specialize in permanent judgment, in labeling people forever by their worst moments, is there not something deeply necessary about a message insisting that transformation and growth remain possible for every human being, no matter their past? Consider his insistence on balancing outward discipline with inward sincerity, refusing to let either dimension of a meaningful life eclipse the other. How many of us today struggle precisely with that same imbalance? Either going through the motions of responsibility and routine without any real inward engagement, or, on the other hand, chasing vague notions of personal spirituality or self-improvement without any real structure or discipline to give that pursuit lasting shape. His life stands as a reminder that genuine transformation requires both the structure of discipline and the depth of sincerity, working together rather than standing in opposition to one another. Consider, too, his example of refusing worldly power and status when it threatened to compromise his integrity. In an age when so much of public life, in nearly every field, seems to reward self-promotion, the chasing of influence, and the accumulation of status and attention, his example stands almost as a quiet rebuke, a reminder that there is a different kind of greatness available to human beings. A greatness measured not by how much power or recognition one accumulates, but by the depth of one's integrity and the sincerity of one's service to others. And consider, finally, his 25 years of disciplined seclusion, that long, difficult stretch of inward struggle before he ever stepped onto a public stage. In our current culture, we often expect instant transformation, instant mastery, instant impact. We are conditioned to think that meaningful change should happen quickly, visibly, and with immediate reward. His life tells a very different story. It tells us that the deepest and most lasting kind of impact often requires long, unseen, unglamorous seasons of inward work. Seasons where no one is watching, where there is no applause, no recognition, no immediate reward, only the quiet, difficult labor of building genuine character. Only after that long unseen labor did his public influence emerge, and when it did, it proved powerful and lasting precisely because it was built on such a deep and well-tested foundation. There is one more dimension of his life worth drawing out before we close, and that is the way he treated ordinary weakness with compassion rather than condemnation. It would have been easy, for a man of his scholarly stature and spiritual reputation, to speak only to the already devoted, to surround himself with an inner circle of the most disciplined and accomplished students, and to treat the struggling, the sinful, and the spiritually lost with distance or disdain. The historical record suggests the opposite. His gatherings, by multiple accounts, were filled with an extraordinarily broad cross-section of Baghdad's population, scholars and merchants, seated alongside laborers and the destitute, the respected and the disreputable, listening to the same words in the same room. He is remembered for addressing people struggling with addiction, with theft, with broken family relationships, and with despair over their own moral failures, not by shaming them into silence, but by insisting, again and again, that the door back toward goodness remained open to them specifically, not despite their failures, but precisely because those failures, once honestly confronted, could become the very starting point of genuine transformation. This is, I would suggest, one of the most quietly radical aspects of his legacy, a spiritual authority of towering reputation, who nonetheless made his teaching most accessible to those who felt least worthy of it. We should also take a moment to appreciate the sheer intellectual range required to hold together everything we have discussed tonight. Here was a man equally at home debating fine points of Hanbali legal reasoning with the trained jurists of Baghdad, and sitting with an illiterate laborer explaining, in the simplest possible terms, why honesty matters more than material gain. Here was a man capable of writing dense technical works of Islamic law, and also capable of delivering sermons so emotionally direct that hardened men wept openly in front of entire crowds of strangers. This combination, rigorous scholarship paired with genuine emotional and spiritual accessibility, is rare in any era, and it may be the single clearest explanation for why his influence proved so much more durable than that of many of his equally learned contemporaries, whose names, however respected in their own time, are known today mostly to specialist historians rather than to millions of ordinary people across the globe. My friends, when we ask how one man managed to change hearts across centuries, I believe the answer is not found in any single dramatic event or singular miraculous moment, however much such stories have accumulated around his memory over time. The answer is found in the consistency and depth of his character, forged through genuine hardship, genuine discipline, and genuine sincerity, and then expressed outward through decades of teaching, generosity, and service to ordinary people struggling with the same basic human questions that all of us continue to struggle with today. What does it mean to live an honest life? What does it mean to find peace amid uncertainty? What does it mean to turn back toward goodness after falling short? What does it mean to care for those around us who have less than we do? These are not questions confined to 11th century Baghdad. These are the enduring questions of every human generation, including our own. That, I believe, is why his name continues to be spoken with reverence today, why his tomb in Baghdad continues to draw visitors, why his teachings continue to be studied, translated, and passed down through an unbroken chain of students stretching across nearly 1,000 years and spanning nearly every corner of the globe. It is not because of legend alone. However much legend has grown up around his memory, it is because the substance underneath that legend, the real, historically grounded substance of a disciplined, sincere, generous, and deeply principled life, continues to speak directly to something enduring in the human heart. So as we close tonight, I want to leave you not simply with historical facts, though I hope you have found those facts genuinely interesting, but with an invitation to reflection. Ask yourself what it might mean to build the kind of inward discipline he built, quietly, patiently, without needing immediate recognition. Ask yourself what it might mean to speak and act with the kind of sincerity he insisted upon, doing what is right not for the sake of appearance, but because it is right. Ask yourself what it might mean to extend the kind of generosity he practiced toward those around you who are struggling, without expecting anything in return. And ask yourself what it might mean to hold firmly to your own integrity, even when the world offers you shortcuts to status and power that would require compromising the values you know to be true. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani did not change hearts across centuries because he sought fame. He changed hearts because he pursued sincerity so deeply that sincerity itself became the very thing that drew people toward him, generation after generation, long after his own voice had gone silent. And perhaps that is the final lesson worth carrying with us tonight, that the most enduring influence any of us can hope to have on this world is rarely built through the pursuit of influence itself, but through the quiet, consistent, unglamorous pursuit of genuine goodness, sincerity, and service, trusting that whatever impact is meant to follow from that pursuit will follow in its own time, in its own way, long after we are gone. Thank you.